Well, I detect that there are some people here today that weren't here yesterday. And I did something quite complicated and important yesterday, and my practice is to start with a summary of what I did in the previous day. So I will summarize it, and if there are people who want to go through it in detail again, and the others don't mind the review, I don't mind doing the whole thing in detail again. We are in chapter 5 of the Laws of Repentance of the Rambam, and there he raises the problem of foreknowledge and free will. It's very important to understand exactly what the problem is, and then it's very important to understand how he deals with it, and I'm going to also put in how others deal with it. There are two different approaches to dealing with this problem. So, here's how the problem is defined. When I make a free choice, let's say I'm choosing between two courses of action, A and B, this is how it seems to me. It seems to me that I could do A and I could do B. I have control over both of them. I've been in similar circumstances. Sometimes I've done A, sometimes I've done B, and I'm choosing now which one to do. And I make the choice to do B. Now, the critic says, God knows everything, right? I say, right. And he even knows the future, right? Right. So yesterday already he knew that you were going to do B. Right. He says, well, then, could you really have done A? Was A open for you? Was A in your power? Was A a possibility for you? What would it mean to do A when yesterday he knew that you were going to do B? To do A would make his knowledge yesterday wrong, false. Do you have the power to make God's knowledge false? Isn't God's knowledge perfect? Isn't it infallible, which means impossible to be wrong? That means you surely didn't have the power to do A. Your picture of how you are when you make a decision has got to be wrong. It isn't true that there were two alternatives. Both of them were in my power. I could have done either, whichever one I wanted. I could have done A, and I did do B, but A was just as available to me. That's got to be a wrong picture, because you yourself admit that yesterday God knew you were going to do B, which means that today A wasn't available to you. That's the problem of foreknowledge and free will. Notice that God's knowledge yesterday knocks out the path not taken. It knocks out the alternative possibility. God's knowledge yesterday doesn't force me to do what I do today. That's a different question and has nothing to do with this. Nowhere do we have the idea that God's knowledge pushes me, forces me to do anything. No, I do what I did by myself, but I couldn't have done anything else. So I'm not really choosing between alternatives. Sometimes, instead of speaking of free will, people speak of free choice. They do speak that way. And the critic says, you didn't have a free choice here, because according to your own picture, since God yesterday knew that you were going to do B, A wasn't available to you. That's the problem. Okay? Now, some people give an answer to this question. They say that the one who's setting up the problem is unfairly sneaking an assumption in under the table. And once you point out what the assumption is, and you realize that you don't have to agree with it, you see that his problem falls apart. This is a way of solving the problem, showing that the question can be answered. And here's how it goes. Let's go through the argument again. I see myself as having A and B both available. It's up to me. I could choose either one. I choose B. Then, God knew yesterday already that I was going to choose B. Up to there, I think it's okay. And now the critic says, well, did you really have A available? Was A really under your power? Was A really possible for you? For you to do A would mean to contradict God's knowledge yesterday that you're going to do B, and that you don't have the power to do. At this point, I want to ask, when we talk about the world, we talk about history, we talk about what happens. History is just the events that take place. In this case, what happened in the real world? What happened in the real world is I chose B, and Yesterday God knew I was going to choose B. That's what really happened. Now we're asking about something that didn't happen. We're asking about doing A. A didn't happen. Won't happen. Will never happen. The opportunity is over. I chose B. And we're asking whether A was possible. So we're not asking about what really happened. We're asking about something else. Was something else an alternative that was available? So let's distinguish. There's the real world in which I chose B and God knew I chose B. And everything is perfectly consistent. And now I'm describing what in today's language we could call a virtual world. Another world which never existed, it won't exist. A world in which I choose A. Is that possible? Is there something contradictory in the idea of another world in which I choose A instead of B? Well, let's start. I'm building this scenario, this fantasy of my choosing A, of choosing A, right? And now I say, okay. So now in this fantasy, which never happened, it won't happen. It's just a fantasy in my mind. In this fantasy where I choose A, in that fantasy world, what does God know yesterday? In that fantasy world. Not in my real world, but in the fantasy world. So at this point, what the critic is doing is saying, well, listen, in the real world he knew B, so put in the fantasy world also that he knew B. Oh, then you're going to have trouble. Because then in the fantasy world I do A and he knows B, and you have a contradiction. But who says you have to do that? When you're describing the fantasy world, who says you have to put knowing B into the yesterday of that world? Maybe. In our world, I do B, and God knows yesterday I'm going to do B. In the fantasy world, I actually do A, and yesterday he knows I do A. And then there's no problem. Who told you to stick B into the fantasy world and make trouble? Once you realize that that's what the critic is doing, he's setting you up. When you move to B and say, well, in B, I'm imagining that I do A instead of when you go to the second world, the virtual world, I imagine that I'm doing A instead of B, and then I'm wondering what else is going on in that virtual world, not the real world, in the virtual world. And he says, yeah, well, stick in yesterday over there B, and now you're doing A, and it's a contradiction. Who told you to stick B in over there? That's the extra assumption that he's making, which you see that you could deny. Now let me make it a little bit more intuitive. This, what I'm telling you now, comes from Bertrand Russell, who was a very famous atheist of the 20th century, British philosopher, very great philosopher. He was an atheist his whole life, and he wrote books against Christianity. But he said, if you want to beat up the religious believer, don't use this problem. Because this problem, foreknowledge and free will, has a very simple solution. God knows yesterday that what I'm going to choose today. How does he know? Gee, how does he know? I don't know. We didn't even ask that question. Where does he get his knowledge from? Maybe, says Russell, maybe he gets his knowledge yesterday by taking a look at today, looking forward in time to see what's going to happen 24 hours later. Now, that's hard for you and me, but we're just people, right? We're talking about God. So yesterday he looks forward and says, what's Gottleib going to do tomorrow? Sort of around 6:45 in the evening. Do A or B? Let's take a look. And then I do B, and he sees me doing B, and that's how he knows yesterday that I'm going to do B. He knows by observing me. Now, if that's true, and we go to the virtual world, well, how are we going to describe that? In the virtual world today, I really do A. What's God going to know yesterday in the virtual world? Well, he's going to take a peek forward, 24 hours. He's going to see that I'm doing A, and therefore, the 24 hours before, he'll know that I'm doing A, and that's perfectly consistent. There's no problem at all. So you see, there's no convincing reason why you have to take God's knowledge from the real world and put that identical knowledge into the virtual world. The virtual world is a different world. It's a world that never happens, never will happen. It's just a fantasy. The question is how you should describe it. And given the idea that God gets his knowledge from my action, he gets it by observing my action. That being the case, of course, in that world, if I do A, he will correctly observe that I do A, and he'll know that I do A. By the way, I want you to know that the Maharal, in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, second chapter of the first Mishnah, says this word for word, and he points out that the language of both the verses and the rabbinic literature about God knowing the future is language of vision. Tzofe asidos. He overlooks, he sees and observes the future. Ra'ah, he sees. So it's the language of seeing that suggests that he gets his knowledge from us, and so he gets his knowledge from us, the critic's attack is incorrect. That's one way of solving the problem. This way is done by the Sadia Gaon and the Keres Yitzchak and the Chivas Arosh and others. That's the solution to the problem. It's not the Rambam's attitude, but it's the solution to the problem. Are we together so far? Okay. So this already means that we don't lose a lot of sleep over it, because the problem is based on the critic smuggling in an extra assumption, which we could easily deny. Now, the Rambam doesn't take this way out. In particular, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 17, he's discussing a certain school of Arabic philosophy, and he says, by the way, these people believe that God has foreknowledge and we have free will, and a little thought will reveal to you that that's a contradiction. End of story. Over. Forget it. Nevertheless, here in the Mishnah Torah, he does address it. Now, we have to work hard, though, to understand exactly what he means and what he says here. I'm going to give you the praise yesterday. I read through the whole text. Here, I'll just explain it to you. The Rambam has a principle that God is beyond all comprehension, beyond all conceptualization, beyond all description, beyond all understanding. Indeed, when Moses says to God, "Show me your glory," God says to him, "Man cannot see me and live." The Rambam understands glory there as understanding his essence. Tell me what you are. Show me what you are. Let me understand what you are. And God says to him, "Ki lo yorani ha'adam v'chai." Man cannot see me, understand me, grasp me, and live, which implies that after death you could. And the Rambam actually holds that. We're not dealing with that now. So, we are not able to describe God at all. You'll tell me that in our literature there are hundreds, if not thousands, of descriptions of God. In Part 1, Chapter 54, Maimonides says at length, we don't describe what God is, we describe what God does. We describe his actions, not what he is. All the descriptions which look like they're describing him have to be translated into descriptions of what he does. That's all that's available to us. And by the way, we describe what he does because he told us what he does, not because we figured it out, not because we have a theory or intuition or a meditation or a fantasy. But we can understand it. When it's describing what he does, we can understand it. Now, the problem we started with was a contradiction between foreknowledge and free will. If you stop describing God, then you don't say he knows. That's a description. You don't say that. Of course, don't make the mistake of thinking, if I don't say he knows, then I'm saying he's ignorant. No, of course not. You don't say he knows and you don't say he's ignorant because you don't describe him at all. Not to say he knows and not to say he's ignorant. Neither one. You just don't describe him at all. I know it's very un-Jewish to keep quiet, and not talk, but that's the he says you can't even say he exists and you can't even say that he's one. You can't say anything about God. All that has to be translated into what we say about his actions. Yes, there's negative theology for people who know about that, chapters 57 and 8 in the first part. Okay, we know about that. We're not doing that here. That's for the aficionados. So, the problem collapses. I call it dissolving the problem rather than solving it, because you can't state it. The problem is supposed to be a contradiction between A and B. We're giving up B. We're just not saying it. Then the way we look at HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is to justify certain things that he says, is this. I don't say that he knows, but I don't want that to be interpreted as a weakness. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do everything we do with knowledge. He just doesn't do it with knowledge. He does it another way, some other way that we don't understand. So when I say that he doesn't know, I'm not reducing his powers. I'm simply reducing I'm confessing my ignorance as to how he accomplishes this. And the example that I gave yesterday is, if you get in a time machine and go back 200 years, you take with you an MP4 memory plus some small speakers. And on the memory is a synthesizer's imitation of a violin. And you're talking to people 200 years ago, and you turn it on, play it, they stare at you, they stare at the box, and they say, wow, how'd you get a guy with a violin into that little box? How did you do that? That's astonishing. And you say, well, actually, there's no guy with a violin in the box. Don't lie to us. We know what makes that sound. We're cultured people. That's a violin. We know that. We know what a violin is. We know how it's played. We just want to know how you got him into the box. So I think you say, look, really, there's no guy in there with a violin. This is being produced in a way that you can't even imagine. Yeah, it sounds like a violin, I agree. But it's being produced by a way that you can't even imagine. You get the effect of a violin-type sound, but you don't get it from a violin being played. Something like that is when we say that when God runs the world, he runs the world in a way that knowledge would dictate this type of running of the world, but he doesn't do it with knowledge. He does it with something else, and we can't imagine something else with which he does it. That's the Rambam's way of looking at it, and that being the case, we can't raise the problem. So either you solve it the way I said in the first solution, or you dissolve it the way the Rambam does. Now, why does the Rambam reject the first solution? Here, he doesn't say this word for word, but in the first part of the guide, he says at least 6 times, God is not affected by anything. Nothing causes anything in God. The word that's used in the Hebrew translation of the Arabic is hi pa'alus, something operating on him, having an effect on him. And if I remember the numbers correctly, he says it 6 times. And 4 out of this, he says, well, if something has an effect on him, that he'll change, and we don't believe that God changes. That's one thing. But the other 2 times, he doesn't hinge it on change. Simply, nothing affects God. He's immune from being affected by the world around him. He's the creator. He's the sustainer of the universe. He makes things happen. Nothing happens to him that comes from us. So if that's the case, he's not going to accept a picture where his knowledge is a result of our action, which is the position of the solution. He's not going to accept that. He can't allow that. That being the case, his attitude towards the problem is to dissolve it. Now, he doesn't say God is beyond all description and all understanding to solve this problem. He has an entirely separate philosophy which dictates that. It's really achdus, God's oneness, which dictates it. It just so happens, it conveniently falls out that this problem goes away. That's what the Rambam says. That's as far as I got yesterday. Now, I want to reply to the kind of critique that I sometimes hear. Rabbi, you're very slick, you're very clever, but the bottom line is you can't solve the problem. Why don't you just be honest and say you haven't got it? You can't describe, it's beyond, God's beyond our conceiving and so on and so on. That's all fluff. No intellectually responsible person would ever say that. Things beyond your ability to understand. That's just a cheat that's covering up the fact that you don't have a solution for the problem. So let's think for a few minutes about this idea that declaring something beyond human understanding is somehow a cheat, it's irresponsible, it's dishonest. Is that really true? Let me give you a few examples that I think are worthwhile thinking about here. The Rambam says in the guide that the philosophers have said that there are things beyond human ability to understand and know. And he says, I'm telling you that because I don't want you to think I'm telling you this because I want to hide something from my religion. Even philosophers said it. And he gives an example of a problem which he says is beyond human ability to solve. Now, the Rambam was writing 900 years ago. So if you've built up your impenetrable gaiva and chutzpah, you say, poor Maimonides, lived 900 years ago. Let's hear his problem. I'm sure that we'll take it off in a snap. Okay, is the number of stars even or odd? Let's hear your answer. Tell me when you're going to have an answer. The current estimate is that there are 10 to the 22 stars. That's a 1 with 22 zeros. That's a lot. Going to count them up? Will you find all of them? What happens if one star is behind another star and you can't see it? You're really going to find out whether the number of stars is odd or even? Maybe the Rambam thought of a problem 900 years ago that's insoluble even today, hey? Even with high-speed computers. Even with the Hubble telescope. You're not going to solve that problem. So maybe there are things that are, beyond our ability to solve. Well, let's take unsolved problems in science. Why do the stars shine? Until about 100 years ago, nobody had a clue. Was it somehow intellectually dishonest for people to say, well, we see them shining, but boy, oh boy, they're the same every night for thousands of years? That's not like my bonfire, That's not like bioluminescence when the creature dies. I mean, what is fueling that light? We don't have a clue. Isn't that normal? Aren't there things about which we don't have a clue? Why would it be a cheat to say, here's something which produces certain results, but the thing that's producing the results is something which we don't understand? So the critic says, well, okay, it's true. By the way, in quantum mechanics, nobody understands why light and elementary particles do what they do. The greatest scientists have confessed that we have no clue why they're doing what they're doing. We can predict what they do, but I don't know why they do it. So then the critic says, well, okay, you're right that sometimes we do lack understanding, but we never pledge allegiance that it's impossible to understand. So that's where it's irrational. That's where it's supposed to be dishonest and cheating. Now let's think for a moment. Let's chip away at the problem a little bit. Do you hold, I asked the critic, that all unsolved problems could be solved? You hold that? Somehow you know that human capacity covers all outstanding problems? How would you know that? Surely you could imagine some of the problems we haven't solved will never be solved because we can't solve them. Suppose the problem needs 14 trillion computing indices in order to solve. Well, we're supposed to have 86 billion neurons, which gives you several trillion connections, and we have more than that because it's been discovered in the last couple of years that glial cells also function in information processing, and there are about as many glial cells as there are neurons, so you got 172 billion computing pieces, and you have thousands of connections between them, so you have trillions of connections, but it's a finite number of connections. And maybe there are complicated problems that just need more connections, and you don't have them. Is that inconceivable? Something wrong with thinking that way? Why would you have a principle that human beings can solve all problems? So, if we say this is insoluble, it's not that you know they're all soluble and we're wrong. That's surely not correct. So maybe you say, well, I wouldn't be so rash as to identify this as an insoluble one. No, you should just be open-minded and see whether you get to it or not. At this point, I say, you're right. If I were conducting an investigation, then maybe that would be so. But here, the creator of the universe told me I'm not going to get it. And he created my mind. So presumably he knows that this one is beyond me. And after all, suppose you met E.T. And suppose E.T. demonstrated gigantically greater powers than we have. And suppose E.T. told you, and me you're not going to understand, because to understand me you need 47 quadrillion connections and you don't have them. Couldn't you trust him? Couldn't you say, okay, look, you're much better than we are. You know more, you can do more than we do. You're telling us we can't understand you? You're probably right. We can't understand you. Comes out that there's absolutely nothing intellectually dishonest or weak or cheating about identifying the idea that God is impossible to understand, and that all we can deal with is the output. We can deal with the consequences, and that being the case, it's perfectly legitimate to say we're not going to say that God knows, because that would be something we understand, and we can't say that about God. That's the background for the Rambam's position on the subject. Are we together so far? Okay, now an older let me just make one more remark because I'm trying to correct the record and I can't go back and find all the recordings and change all the recordings. Up until about 3 years ago, I used to say there were 4 solutions to the problem. And then I read a Teshuva of the Rivash and I realized that, he's a much better philosopher than I am. And I realized that there are really only 2 approaches here. Either you say God's knowledge depends upon what we do, and then you get the solution that I described to you, or you don't, and then you're stuck. In particular, people will tell you, this is even in one of the commentaries, people will tell you that God is beyond time. Since God is beyond time, the problem is avoided. The Rivash, word for word, rejects that. And he rejects it on the following grounds. Let's say God is beyond time. He's not in time. Well, if he's not in time, I can't say he knew it yesterday. There's no yesterday for him. Okay. So then I'll speak, let's not use verbs because in English verbs are tense, past, present, and future, and then you have time sneaking in. Let's just say there's God and there's God's knowledge. Now ask, the contents of God's knowledge, does it depend upon what we do or doesn't it? If the contents of God's knowledge, particularly God's knowledge has as part of its content what we do, that's some of the things that is in his knowledge. So is the content of God's knowledge about what we do, is it there because of what we do or not? If it's there because of what we do, then you can solve the problem the way I said in the solution. And if it isn't, if God's knowledge is somehow independent and absolute and detached from what we do, then the same problem arises. If I did A and or I did B, this way I did this year. If I did B and in God's knowledge you have that I do B, because God's knowledge is complete and perfectly accurate, then it'll be impossible for me to have done A because in God's knowledge there's B. And then doing A would contradict God's knowledge, and that's not possible. The same problem arises even if God's outside of time. Putting God outside of time doesn't change the argument at all. The only question is, do you picture God's knowledge as depending upon what we do or you don't? If it depends upon what you do, you get the solution. If it doesn't, then you go the way the Rambam goes. I don't know of any other treatments of the subject, but these two, a problem that you can solve on one ground and you can dissolve on other grounds is a problem over which you don't lose too much sleep. Questions up to here? Yeah, so you had a question? Yeah.
About what you were saying earlier about being able to understand God. So is one able to wrap his head around any concept of God, or is it completely unfathomable?
Of what God is, according to Rambam, well, let's be careful now. Remember, he quotes the verse, Ki lo yirani hada v'chai. I cannot be understood while man is alive. That implies that after death, the barrier, according to the Rambam, is the body. The body is a filter which doesn't allow this kind of understanding through. According to the Rambam, let's say in the world to come, there's no body. There's no pause, comma, body. So there's only souls. And when there's only souls, then it is implied by what he says that it could be understood. So it's not unfathomable. We can't fathom it in our present circumstances. That means the truth itself isn't unfathomable. And I must tell you, this is an aside of my own, I must tell you, those people who insist that it must be unfathomable, I think they have something to answer. You're telling me that God can't make a creature that understands him? Why would that be? Why would you want to limit God's power that way? You'd have to argue that there's something in being a creature rather than being the creator that sets a limit on his intellect that he can't understand what it is to be the creator. It's not obvious that that's true. Not obvious that that has to be the case. So you could say God created us in such a way that we can't understand. That's one thing. He may have decided to do that for his own reasons. But to say that it must be so, I think that's very extravagant. Yeah.
So if we can't understand God at all, why did the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov have the argument about Tzimtzum, where they're arguing about how, in what way God exists in this world, or in what way whether God is in this world or not in this world?
No one thinks that God is in this world. No one. No one can think that. things in this world that have a physical position are physical. Only physical things can have a physical position. The argument there is about how he interacts with the world, what he does in the world, what aspects of his plan get acted out in different regions of the world. No one thinks that this, God's finger is over there and God's foot is over there and God's eyes are over there. No one thinks that.
Right. They think it's. I thought it was like God's essence. Like God is within. Like, isn't the argument of the Baal Shem Tov basically that we live within God?
Chas v'sholom. Within is a physical description. It means there's a space, and then there's something inside that space. If that's meant as a physical description, it's absolutely unacceptable. If it's meant as poetry for something else, that's fine. Then we should talk about what the something else is. So, for example, when people say, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere, the 6-year-olds sing the song. So the simple way to replace that with something meaningful is God's will sustains everything, everywhere, down to the tiniest details. That we do believe in, that His will gives everything its existence. But that doesn't mean He's there. It means His will is giving it its existence. And His will is what He does.
So what are the two different positions that those two people hold?
Okay, I'm talking here about free will. I'm talking about Rambam and Teshuva. That's something that's very far away from my topic. Are we together so far? Okay, now let's continue on chapter 5. Now Rambam goes to a different set of problems to deal with.
Rabbi Gottleib, you have a spare handout?
I did these before, and I'll leave this one here. I think this is as far as I got. Okay, so so this is. Let me I'll take the Rambam now. I didn't print. Oh, no, I forgot about that. Here it is. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, let's take it around. Because chapter 5 goes on. I didn't print it out yet. Okay. Okay, this is really an introduction now to the 6th chapter. I'll translate for you what he says. This is a different set of problems. This problem of foreknowledge and free will is a philosophical problem. Philosophical thought, trying to comprehend what the Torah is teaching us. In the 6th chapter, he's talking about an internal problem of Jewish sources against Jewish sources. There are many verses in the Torah and in the prophets that appear to contradict this principle. And most people are tripped up by these verses, and it occurs to them, on the basis of these verses, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does decree on a person to do good or evil. And a man's heart is not in his own power to move him to the direction in which he wants. There are many verses which seem to imply this, and people are misled by them. And I will now explain to you a great principle, and then you will understand how to explain these verses. When a person or the people of a country are doing evil, and the evil is done freely, with his own understanding and with his own will, the way I have explained to you that people act, then it is appropriate for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to punish him, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows how he'll punish him. Sometimes it would be punished with him in this world, sometimes with his money, and sometimes with his children, and sometimes and sometimes it's punished with death. And then sometimes he's punished with him in the world to come. And nothing will happen in this world. And sometimes he's punished in both. People do things and they have consequences. And he says no one knows when you look at a particular transgression on the books as a law, or when you look at a concrete person who's performing the transgression, it's impossible for us to know how God will want the punishment to be applied. Now he says, when does all of this apply? Only when he has not done tshuva. If he does tshuva, tshuva is a barrier in front of punishment. When a person does tshuva, all punishment is off the books. That's the great, great power of tshuva. Nothing can stand against tshuva. Now, if you look in the first chapter of Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam quotes a Mishnah from the Gemara in Yuma, which says there are 4 categories of transgressions. The least serious person does tshuva and he's finished with it. A more serious one requires him to do tshuva and go through Yom Kippur. A more serious one requires him to go through tshuva, Yom Kippur, and suffering. And the most serious, involving the desecration of God's name, would require tshuva, Yom Kippur, suffering, and death. So you say, now hold on. Right now, in chapter 6, he tells me that tshuva is a barrier to punishment. And in chapter 1, he tells me if a person performs one of these serious, let's say, category 3, because of what he did, there has to be tshuva, Yom Kippur, and suffering. Isn't that a contradiction? And the answer is no. It's not a contradiction because the suffering in chapter 1 isn't punishment. It's not punishment. When a person does a transgression, that leaves a mark. It leaves a mark on his own soul. It leaves a mark on the environment. It may leave a mark on other people. When he does tshuva, he no longer deserves to be punished for the crime, but he needs to be cleansed. A person who foolishly goes to a car race and doesn't wear a helmet and ends up with a cracked skull, when he undergoes surgery, that's not a punishment. They just don't want him to die. So in chapter 1, what he's talking about is suffering which serves to repair the damage of the transgression. Here he's talking about punishment. But tshuva stops punishment. So now you have the following scenario. He did the transgression. God has a plan of punishments for that particular transgression. But when he does tshuva, that plan is put aside because no punishment can be applied when a person does tshuva. Now, and just as a person sins by his own free choice, so he does tshuva with his own free choice, and that's how he repairs it. However, you can get a dilemma. It could be that a person will do such a tremendous crime, a tremendous transgression, or so many transgressions, that before the true judge, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it is necessary that he should be punished. He's done a crime that must be punished. But now, if he'll do tshuva, according to the rules that God himself set up, if he'll do tshuva, he won't be punished. So how do you solve that problem? You solve that problem by God taking away his ability to do tshuva. By taking away his ability to do tshuva, God can guarantee that he'll be punished in the way that he needs to be punished, should be punished. It's right to punish him. Now let's think, because people speak about this sometimes in sort of loose vocabulary, and it creates to a false impression. They say, well, if God wants to punish him, what can he do? The only way he can punish him is that he should prevent him from doing tshuva. It makes it sound like, poor God, he's caught in a maze. He's caught in a trap. He has no other way out, so he's forced to do this, And it's not as if there's something stronger than God, more powerful than God, that's limiting his choices. It's God's own principles that limit his choices. When he sets up the principle that tshuva always works, nothing can stand against tshuva. Tshuva always prevents punishment. Once he sets up that principle, and you have a case where he wants to protect punishment, that punishment has to be able to do, so then the only way to satisfy all his principles is to stop the person from doing tshuva. If he doesn't do that, then the person can do tshuva and will avoid the punishment. So it's not as if God is trapped, it's just that he set up principles and these are the consequences of his principles. He could have done it differently. He could have said, sometimes I punish even if he does tshuva. But he didn't say that. Once he didn't say that, so then this is the way out. And this is what happened to Pharaoh in Egypt when it says that God hardened his heart. That's exactly what happened. The first time it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart is in the 6th plague. If I take the text straight, it means the first 5 plagues, he hardened his own heart. The words really say that. At that point, God says, the jig is up, you must be punished. And since you must be punished, I'm not going to give you the opportunity to do tshuva. Yes, Moses will come, and Moses will say, you have to let them go. Look what happened to you. I predict other disasters are going to happen to you. But you're not going to give up. You're not going to give up because I'm going to stop you. Because I don't want you to do tshuva. And by the way, God did this to Sichon and Og also. It's not just to Paro. And the Rambam says that God will do this in the future also. That's part of what you find in the verses that sets people off. Because you find that God hardens someone's heart. That sounds like God is causing him to do evil, not allowing him to repent. It sounds like God is making him evil. And Moses says, no, he made himself evil. And now God is not allowing him to repair the evil because the evil that he's already done and done freely is something that needs to be punished. And if he'll do tshuva, he can't be punished. That's the Rambam's principle here. So tomorrow, Hashem will go through the actual verses and I'll show you how they apply. By the way, this applies to both Jews and non-Jews. Pharaoh's one, but Isaiah talks about the Jewish people at a certain stage in history, and he applies it there just as much as well. And I must tell you, I heard this Rambam, I don't know, lots of years ago, and I've taught it many, many times. And then I happened to take a look at the Ramban, and I was astonished to find that the exact verses that the Rambam quotes could be understood in a different way, which gave me a big lesson in caution. Don't think you know for sure what it says, or only what it says. Let's take it again. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Ramban says, on the contrary, the cumulative effect of the plagues would have overwhelmed Pharaoh to the point where he loses his free will. He's so beaten, he's so battered, he's so exhausted, he's so frightened that he'll agree to let them go out of desperation. No. God hardened his heart so that he could continue to make free decisions. He restored his free will by hardening his heart, not taking away his free will. If you've ever, I don't hope this isn't true for you, but if you've ever watched a prize fight, boxing, you see one of the boxers in the end of the 8th round is really battered and he's bleeding, he's dizzy. He goes back to his stool in his corner. He says to his coach, "It's over. Call it a TKO, a technical knockout. I can't go back out there." And the job of the coach, in his 60 seconds, is to restore his courage, restore his resolve, so he goes out and fights the 9th round. Here, the coach is restoring his free will. He's had his free will knocked out of him. So from the verses themselves, you cannot determine whether it means what the Rambam says or what the Ramban says. So that should be a lesson, that not to think that the verses are plain and then logical, and I'm reading them literally. It's a lifetime study, to understand verses and understand them well. You had a question?
The Rambam went through it because I was thinking about how would this affect the principle and the commitment of Hashem with free will once there is like a commitment with Teshuva which overcomes. So since Hashem's commitment to Teshuva is such that he doesn't want this person to make teshuva, so he blocks his free will. Like that's the level.
Okay. So let me answer this. Also, I just have a few minutes. I can do that. So yes, you're right. Your logic is right. Here, God's commitment to teshuva overrides his commitment to free will. So many years ago, I thought to myself, but isn't the whole purpose of human existence to make free decisions? Isn't that why we were created? If God takes away free will, isn't he contradicting the purpose for which we're created? Isn't that somehow a loss of the purpose of the universe and so forth and so on? And I figured out a very clever, sophisticated answer to that problem. I taught it for years, and then I figured out the problem is dumb. Dumb in the first place. I shouldn't have taken the problem seriously altogether. Let's ask this question. What is God's commitment to our free will? How big a commitment is it? Is it unlimited? Is it limited? What kind of limits does it have? Well, here's a biggie, right? We die. When we die, free will is over. So God doesn't have unlimited commitment to our free will. And then there's 30% of your life spent sleeping. Where you can exercise free will. And then there are injuries, or there's medications, where you're not conscious, you don't exercise free will. God's commitment to our free will is very limited. So the way to understand what happened to Pharaoh is this. God looks at Pharaoh's life, and the way I'm describing it at the end of the fifth plague, and he says, Pharaoh, you've had it. You've had it. For my money, you could drop dead. There's nothing else that needs to be done in the world by you. Your contribution is over and nothing to do. I have no more commitment to your free will because for my plans for you, you could drop dead now. I have something else that I want to happen. I'm using you as a tool to do something else, but I don't want you to use your free will to escape punishment. If I didn't need you for this project, I would have you dead now, and I'd punish you now. But I need you for the project. So since I need you for the project, but my taking away your free will is no more controversial than my decreeing that you should die, in which case you lose your free will for sure. So there is no deep philosophical question here. How can God take away free will? Isn't it contradicting the purpose of creation, so forth and so on? That's just illegitimate. Yeah.
So when it comes to answering these questions about God's results, what He could do, and we have these two situations. What is the extent of logic when finding the truth about God? Like, what is its limit as a human being?
I don't think you can answer a question like that in general terms. Each problem has its. The Rambam says in the guide there are certain things you can prove, and there's certain things you can investigate and have good reasons for solving, for adopting a certain conclusion, but not a real proof. And there are other things which you can't investigate. And so it's going to be a matter of degree. And different questions have different, we don't have a doctrinaire answer to that. I don't think anybody does. Not in philosophy, not in science. Those who have answers in science are fools. Yeah, we know evolution is true. We know it for sure. Sure you do. And there are pixies also, I think. Right? Absolute nonsense. So I think you can't say it in general. Each problem is going to be, have to be taken on its own. Just remember, you're not going to discover whether the number of stars is out, even or odd. You're not going to do that. Okay.